The car wasn't beautiful, nor quiet, nor did it inspire respect. The faded blue bodywork bore rust marks on the fenders, and the hood always seemed about to come loose, held in place by a makeshift latch. When the engine was started, it coughed like an old smoker before finally agreeing to run. Even so, every morning, that old sedan appeared punctually in the same place, the side parking lot of a luxurious corporate building in downtown Chicago. The boy always parked in the spot furthest from the main entrance, almost hidden behind a metal garbage container. He jumped out of the car with excessive caution, as if any sudden movement could hurt him. He ran his hand along the roof before closing the door, an automatic, almost affectionate gesture. Then he adjusted his backpack and walked towards the street, blending into the flow of hurried people. He was 16, but his thin body and slumped shoulders made him look younger. His clothes were clean but worn, and his sneakers had long since lost their original whiteness. No one there knew his name. To the executives rushing past, he was just another boy out of place at the wrong time. On the other side of the parking lot, the contrast was stark. The millionaire always arrived a few minutes later, driving a black sports car that gleamed even under the city's grey sky. The roar of the engine announced his presence even before the car stopped. The doors opened smoothly, almost silently, and he got out with the confidence of someone who had never needed to doubt his place in the world. His name was known there, not just by the building's employees, but by anyone even remotely informed about business. He had built his fortune early, exploiting opportunities, crushing competitors, accumulating victories like invisible trophies. He walked erect, his tailored suit visible, his expensive watch reflecting the artificial light of the parking lot. Everything about him exuded control. On that particular morning, something caught his attention. As he handed the keys to the valet, his eyes fell on the old car parked in the distant spot. The contrast between the two vehicles was almost comical. He squinted, watching the boy drive away, and a crooked smile appeared on his face. "Does this car still run?" he asked, without specifying who he was addressing. The valet shrugged, uncomfortable. He didn't answer. The millionaire laughed. Not a hearty, open laugh, but that short, dry laugh that carries judgment. The kind of laugh that doesn't need words to humiliate. The boy listened. He was already used to stares, whispers, and laughter. Still, that sound made him stop for a moment. He didn't turn his face away. He just tightened his grip on his backpack strap and kept walking. The rhythm of his steps didn't change, but something tightened inside him, as it always did. To him, that car was no joke. That was all. Without it, there was no school, no work, no food on some days. There was no past, because that's where the few things that remained lived. There was no future, because everything that could still be saved depended on that tired engine continuing to run. The conflict wasn't announced in grand words or dramatic gestures. It was there, silent, in the space between two worlds that rarely touched, the world of excess and the world of survival. The millionaire entered the building, crossing the marble lobby as if it were a natural extension of himself. He ascended in one of the panoramic elevators, mentally reviewing his busy schedule for the day. Meetings, decisions, figures, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would force him to think beyond his next objective. The boy, however, went in the opposite direction. She walked a few blocks to a small cafe where she worked before school. She put her backpack behind the counter, put on her apron, and began cleaning tables. Her movements were quick and efficient. There was no room for distraction. Every minute mattered. As he scrubbed the surface of a table near the window, his eyes reflexively returned to the street. Even from a distance, he could imagine the parking lot, the old car, the expensive car, the laughter. Not out of open resentment, but because of a question that always returned. Why did some people laugh so easily at what sustained the lives of others? The day passed without major events, but the initial tension did not dissipate. It was like a spark thrown into a dry environment. There was no fire yet, but the possibility was there. In the afternoon, When the boy returned to the parking lot to get his car and go to school, he found something different. The black sports car was still there. The millionaire was chatting animatedly on the phone, pacing back and forth, gesturing impatiently. The boy walked past him, trying not to draw attention. As he got into the old car, the engine took a while to start. He coughed. Silence. He coughed again. 1 second longer than usual. The millionaire looked. This time the laughter didn't come immediately. Instead, a look came. A curious, almost interested look, as if he were looking at a strange object. The boy turned the key once more. The engine finally responded, and the car slowly pulled out of the parking space. As they crossed the exit from the parking lot, their eyes met for a brief moment. Neither of them knew that that banal moment, a stifled laugh, a sputtering engine, a glance exchanged, was the first step in something neither of them was prepared to face. The boy went on his way. The millionaire put his cell phone in his pocket. And the conflict, still invisible to the world, began to move. The parking lot wasn't just a concrete space between tall buildings. It was a silent territory where hierarchies revealed themselves without needing words. The spaces closest to the entrance belonged to the most expensive cars, lined up like symbols of victory. The further away from the revolving glass door, the simpler the vehicles became, until reaching the almost forgotten corner where the blue sedan usually parked. The boy knew that place better than any other. He knew where the lights went out at night, which cameras weren't working, and on which days the security guard made longer rounds, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. That area was the only place where he felt even remotely safe, leaving his car, which served simultaneously as transportation, shelter, and makeshift safe. His name was Ethan, though almost no one called him that. At the coffee shop, he was just Kid. At the public school in the South neighborhood, he was a quiet student who rarely handed in completed assignments, but never caused trouble. The teachers noticed his constant tiredness, the dark circles under his eyes, his wavering attention span. Some suspected something, but the system had little room for questions that didn't come with easy answers. The car had belonged to his father. It wasn't a memento laden with idealized nostalgia, but a practical object, inherited at the moment when everything else was lost. After the accident that took his parents' lives on a poorly lit state highway, the sedan had become the last possession not consumed by medical debts, legal fees, and cold decisions made by adults who never truly knew Ethan. Selling the car would mean losing the only autonomy he still possessed. On the other side of that reality, the millionaire lived surrounded by choices that always seemed advantageous. His name was Richard Hale, founder and CEO of a logistics company that had grown by exploiting regulatory loopholes and aggressive contracts with large retailers. The building where he parked daily was not just a workplace, but a personal monument. Each floor represented a step up his career. Each meeting room held stories of successful negotiations. Richard didn't see himself as a villain. For him, the world functioned based on efficiency. Those who prospered deserved it. Those who fell behind had, in some way, failed to keep up. This logic had helped him sleep soundly for decades, and it was reinforced daily by the rising numbers, the praise in specialized magazines, and the invitations to motivational speeches. Contact with realities like Ethan's was rare. When it happened, it came filtered through reports, statistics, or social marketing campaigns that his company sponsored to improve its public image, never through an old car parked near the garbage. That week, however, small intersections began to accumulate. On Tuesday, Richard left a meeting early and crossed the lobby just as Ethan was entering to ask the security guard for permission to use the building's restroom. The guard hesitated, glancing at the boy's simple uniform before allowing him in. Richard watched the scene for a few seconds longer than usual, not out of empathy, but out of an uncomfortable curiosity. On Wednesday, Richard's sports car was stopped for a few minutes longer than usual at the parking lot exit. A simple electronic problem, quickly resolved by the car's internal system, but enough to cause a delay. During this interval, Ethan slowly drove past in the blue sedan, heading to his night shift at the cafe. Richard's eyes followed the vehicle without him noticing. Meanwhile, Ethan's routine was becoming increasingly burdensome. The cafe was experiencing a decline in business, and the owner was starting to reduce hours. At school, the pressure was mounting with final exams approaching. At night, the boy would park his car in a less busy part of town, sleeping in the back seat when there wasn't enough money for any other option. The engine needed to be in good condition because starting and stopping too often consumed fuel he couldn't afford to waste. The car influenced every decision: where to park, when to eat, how much to work, which routes to avoid. There was no romanticism in it, just constant calculation. Chicago, with its harsh winters and unpredictable summers, didn't help either. The biting wind cut through Ethan's thin clothes, while the heat reflected off the asphalt in summer turned the car's interior into a greenhouse. The city was immense, full of opportunities for those who knew where to look and cruel to those who had no margin for error. Richard, for his part, lived in a gated community a few kilometers away. His apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, had glass walls, and controlled silence. At night, he dined alone or in restaurants where the service anticipated his desires. Still, something that week began to bother him in a vague, almost imperceptible way. It wasn't guilt. It was a fissure. The laughter from that morning in the parking lot would come back to him at random moments, not as regret, but as a scene that didn't seem to fit perfectly into the narrative of absolute success, he told himself. He didn't usually laugh at strangers. He didn't need to. On Friday, a heavy rain fell on the city. Ethan left work late, rushing to his car as water streamed down his face and backpack. The sedan took a while to start again. The erratic sound of the engine echoed in the nearly empty parking lot. Richard was still in the building, reviewing contracts. Hearing the distant noise, he approached the window. He recognized the car immediately. He couldn't explain why, but that sight caught his attention. The boy got into the vehicle, the rain intensified, and the sedan finally drove away, leaving behind a trail of water and light smoke. It was just an old car, just a boy. But their worlds were beginning to converge in a way that no corporate planning or survival instinct could have predicted. Monday began with a problem Ethan couldn't ignore. The engine noise, which previously only appeared during the most difficult starts, now persisted throughout the journey. A metallic squeaking sound emerged whenever the car downshifted, followed by a vibration that spread through the steering wheel. He turned off the radio to listen better, trying to identify the source of the sound, but only managed to confirm the obvious. Something was about to fail. Even so, he moved on. Stopping wasn't an option. Missing work meant less money. Missing school meant losing the only structure that still gave him some kind of future prospect. Every decision was a calculated risk, and the car remained at the center of that calculation. In the corporate building's parking lot, the routine repeated itself. Ethan parked in the distant spot, adjusted the hood with extra care, and walked toward the street. Before driving away, he glanced back for a second longer than usual. The car seemed more tired that morning. At the same time, Richard was facing a different kind of stress. An important negotiation was underway. A contract with a large national chain could further consolidate its market position, but it required aggressive cost cuts. During the meeting, its executives presented cold charts, spreadsheets, and projections. On one of the slides, a map highlighted logistics centers in low-income regions where the company planned to reduce salaries and benefits. Richard approved the plan without hesitation. Tough decisions were part of the game. They always have been. In between meetings, he went down to the parking lot to call an investor. The echo of voices and footsteps mingled with the smell of damp concrete. That's when he noticed the blue sedan again. The hood was slightly bent, more so than usual. There was a dark stain on the ground, just below the engine. Oil. Richard frowned. He took a few steps closer, without realizing he was doing so. He didn't touch the car, just observed. It was a banal scene, but something about it seemed out of place in that controlled environment. "Problems?" he asked, almost without thinking. Ethan, who had just returned to retrieve a notebook he'd forgotten in the back seat, was startled by the sudden voice. He straightened up quickly. "Just old stuff," she replied, without looking directly at the man. The short answer didn't invite conversation. Still, Richard remained there for a few seconds, assessing the car, the boy, the stark contrast between them. "That doesn't seem safe," he commented in a neutral tone. Ethan closed the door carefully. "That's all there is." The sentence hung in the air like a period. Richard realized for the first time that he wasn't talking to someone willing to accept advice. This wasn't youthful stubbornness, it was a breaking point. Ethan got into the car and started the engine. It responded with difficulty, but it started. He drove out of the parking lot without looking back. That night, the problem worsened. Halfway between the cafe and his usual parking spot, the car lost power on a poorly lit avenue. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Ethan tried to restart it several times, but the only sound that came in response was a dry click. He stood there for a few seconds, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. There was no immediate panic, just the cold realization of what it meant. He took his old cell phone out of his pocket, low battery. No unread messages, no contact who could resolve the situation quickly. He pushed the car to the side of the road with effort, feeling his arms burn. The night's chill began to seep into his thin clothes. He sat on the curb, staring at the motionless sedan, as if it were a wounded body. The following morning, Richard arrived at the building earlier than usual. He was still thinking about the meeting, the investors, the numbers. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed something different. The distant parking space was empty, no blue sedans, no new stains on the ground. He paused for a moment, observing the empty space. During the day, he tried to ignore the thought, but it kept coming back insistently. At the end of the afternoon, when he left the building, he found the car again, now parked crookedly, as if it had been put there in a hurry. The hood was open. Ethan was bent over the engine, his hands dirty with grease, his expression concentrated. There was a small toolbox on the floor with makeshift parts. It wasn't a real repair, it was a desperate attempt to buy time. Richard slowed his pace. The boy noticed her presence and straightened up slowly. The look he gave her wasn't one of pleading or challenging. It was one of weariness. "It's not going to work," Richard said, more as an observation than a criticism. Ethan wiped his hands on his pants. "It needs to work." The sentence wasn't filled with anger, it was filled with urgency. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. For the first time in a long time, he couldn't find a quick answer that would solve the problem before him. This wasn't a spreadsheet, it wasn't a contract, it wasn't a calculated risk. It was a real conflict right there, exposed between a broken-down car and a boy who had nowhere to go. And that night would not end like any of the previous ones. The parking lot gradually became a point of constant tension. Ethan started arriving earlier and leaving later, trying to avoid unwanted encounters, but the car's mechanical failure forced him to stay there longer than he would like. Each time the engine refused to start, the surrounding silence seemed to expand, drawing too much attention to someone who preferred not to be seen. The first subplot emerged discreetly, almost imperceptibly. A cleaning lady from the building named Marisol began to notice the boy. She would arrive before dawn, pushing her cleaning supplies cart through the nearly empty parking lot. She saw Ethan sleeping in the back seat on more than one occasion, covered only by a thin coat. She didn't say anything at first. One morning she simply left a thermos of hot coffee on the hood of the car. Ethan found the object when he woke up. He looked around suspiciously but saw no one. He drank his coffee slowly, feeling the warmth descend into his throat like something rare. There was no conversation. Not yet. Meanwhile, another pressure was beginning to build in Richard's world. The contract approved the previous week generated internal resistance. One of the most senior directors, responsible for regional operations, requested a private meeting. He brought data showing that the planned cuts could lead to logistical delays and damage the company's public image. There were reports of employees living in precarious conditions, depending on unreliable transportation to work long shifts. Richard listened impatiently. "The problem isn't ours," he replied, ending the discussion. "Efficiency requires sacrifices." But the word transport echoed strangely after the director left. The car subplot was starting to seep into places Richard didn't want to think about it. On Ethan's side, the situation was getting more complicated. The cafe owner informed him that he would further reduce the shifts. There were days when the boy worked only a few hours, insufficient to cover fuel, food, and small car parts. At night, he studied with books borrowed from the public library, sitting in the front seat, using the dim light of a nearby lamppost. The school was also putting pressure on him. A counselor tried to talk to him about absences and inconsistent performance. Ethan listened in silence, promising to improve, knowing it was an empty promise if the car stopped working altogether. On Thursday, the storm pressure intensified. A cold front was moving over Chicago, with sub-zero temperatures predicted for the following days. Sleeping in the car would become dangerous. Ethan knew this. He needed to fix the mechanical problem before the cold arrived, but his budget didn't allow for professional repairs. That same afternoon, Richard received an invitation to a charity dinner, a lavish event aimed at raising donations for urban social programs. His name appeared as one of the main sponsors. He accepted automatically. That was the image he needed to maintain. As she left the building, she encountered Ethan again. The boy was sitting on the ground, leaning against the car, carefully disassembling a part. The cold wind was already blowing. Richard watched from a distance for a few seconds before approaching. "You should take that to a mechanic," he said. Ethan did not raise his head. Mechanics cost money. Richard remained silent. That simple answer carried more weight than any argument he could present. For the first time, he considered offering direct help, not out of pure altruism, but out of an uncomfortable need to end that scene. "I can pay," he said, almost practically, as if solving any problem. Ethan slowly raised his gaze. There was distrust there, mixed with something bordering on wounded pride. "I don't need charity." Richard felt the impact of the word. Charity, that wasn't how he saw money. For him, it was a tool, a solution. "So what do you call it?" he asked, not harshly, but not softening his stance either. Ethan closed the toolbox. "Call me my life, and I'll take care of it." The conversation ended there, but it left its mark on both of them. That night, Marisol finally spoke to Ethan. She said a few words, offered him a thicker blanket, and pointed out a nearby community shelter. Ethan thanked her, but didn't promise to go. Trusting was still difficult. The subplots slowly intertwined. The pressure of the cold, the refusal of help, Richard's growing unease, the cracks in the corporate image, the silent presence of people who saw more than they let on. Nothing had exploded yet. But time was running out. The change began abruptly, without warning, like almost everything that really matters. On Friday night, the temperature dropped faster than expected. The wind swept through the streets of Chicago like invisible blades, pushing away papers, bags, and anything light enough to give way. Ethan tried to start the car 3 times. On the 4th, the engine responded with a dry crack and nothing more. Silence. He remained seated for a few seconds, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the cold seep into his fingers. There wasn't enough fuel left to try and push the car somewhere else. The sedan was dead, at least for now. Ethan got out of the car and closed the door carefully as if it still mattered. The parking lot was almost empty. The artificial lights created long, distorted shadows. He sat on the ground, leaning against the side of the car, wrapping his arms around his body. There was no plan B. On the other side of town, Richard was leaving the charity dinner. Smiles, raised glasses, speeches about social impact. Everything had gone as expected. As he entered the sports hall, the heater enveloped his body in seconds. The contrast with the wind outside was almost obscene. On his way back, he decided to stop by the office. He needed to pick up some documents before the weekend. As he entered the parking lot, something immediately caught his attention. The blue sedan lay there, motionless, with a thin layer of ice beginning to form around its edges, and beside it, a figure huddled on the ground. Richard parked without much thought. He got out of the car quickly, the cold hitting him hard. He approached and recognized Ethan almost immediately. The boy was trembling, his lips were bluish, his gaze lost on an undefined point ahead. "Hey!" he called, louder than he intended. Ethan lifted his head with difficulty. His eyes slowly came into focus. "No, it didn't work," he murmured, pointing vaguely at the car. Richard took off his own coat without hesitation and placed it over the boy's shoulders. The gesture was automatic before he could even think about it. Ethan's skin was ice cold. "You're going to freeze here," he said firmly. "Come on." Ethan tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond immediately. Richard helped him, holding him by the arm. There was no room for pride at that moment, only survival. Inside the sports car, the heater was on full blast. Ethan huddled in his seat, hands reaching for the hot air vent. He was breathing fast, trying to regain control of his body. Richard watched in silence, his heart beating faster than during any recent negotiation. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he asked after a few minutes. Ethan did not respond immediately. "Because help always comes at a price," he said finally, "and I already pay too much." The phrase hit Richard with unexpected force. He thought of contracts, cuts, decisions made in heated rooms. He thought of the laughter in the parking lot. He thought of the charity dinner from minutes before. He made a decision right there in the car, without spreadsheets or advice. "Your car isn't leaving there today," he said, "but you're not sleeping in it." He took Ethan to a simple hotel nearby. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm. He paid the room without arguing. He handed the key card to the boy. "Tomorrow we'll sort out the car," he said. "For real?" Ethan held the card for a few seconds, as if it were something fragile. "Isn't that charity?" he asked, his voice low. Richard held her gaze. "No, it's a responsibility." That night, Ethan slept in a bed for the first time in weeks, and Richard stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his own apartment, knowing that he had crossed a line that could not be undone. The turning point wasn't the broken-down car. I had decided not to leave. The following morning brought immediate consequences, some predictable, others not. Richard arrived at the hotel early. Ethan was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his backpack at his feet. He had showered and was wearing the same clothes, now clean. His expression was that of someone who still didn't fully trust the ground beneath his own feet. Without many words, they headed to a mechanic's shop in a neighborhood far from the city center. It wasn't a dealership or a fancy place. Richard deliberately chose an ordinary place, where money couldn't solve everything with a simple gesture. The diagnosis came quickly. A problem with the fuel system, accumulated wear and tear, makeshift parts, holding together something that should have failed months ago. The mechanic was straightforward. The car needed more than just an emergency repair. Richard authorized the complete repair. Ethan didn't argue, but he also didn't offer effusive thanks. He observed every movement, every piece removed, as if he needed to mentally register it all so as not to feel eternally indebted. While the car was in the shop, Richard made another decision. He drove Ethan to the corporate building. "I need to take care of a few things," he said. "You can stay there for now." In the lobby, all eyes immediately turned to the boy. Employees, security guards, executives. Ethan felt the weight of that environment, the stark contrast. He walked a few steps behind Richard, as if he knew he didn't belong there. Richard realized, and he didn't ignore it. He caught the attention of a manager and asked him to provide something simple: a table, internet access, a temporary place where the boy could study while they waited for the car. The request caused visible discomfort, but it was granted. The reactions began to spread. Quiet rumors circulated among the employees. Some saw the gesture as personal marketing, others as eccentricity. Few considered it to be genuine. In the early afternoon, Richard was called to an emergency meeting. The regional operations director was present, accompanied by a human resources representative. The issue was clear. Someone had seen Ethan in the building and questioned his presence. This could create problems, the director said. Security, image, precedence. Richard listened without interrupting. "He's not the problem," he finally replied. "The problem is pretending that people like him don't exist." The silence that followed was heavy. The reaction wasn't just external. Richard also felt the internal impact of his own decisions. Every gesture seemed to defy the logic that had guided his life until then. There was no financial return, no immediate benefit. Yet, he continued. Ethan, on the other hand, reacted differently. Sitting in an empty meeting room, he studied with unusual focus. The silence, the temporary stability, the absence of constant fear allowed for something new: concentration. Still, he kept his backpack close by, as if he were ready to leave at any moment. When the car was ready, late in the afternoon, the two went to pick it up. The sedan felt like a different machine, not new but functional. The engine started without hesitation. The sound was firm, reliable. Ethan ran his hand over the steering wheel, absorbing the sensation. "How much did it cost?" he finally asked. Richard responded with the amount. Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't argue. He simply nodded slowly. "I'll pay," he said. "Not now, but I will." Richard did not object. He accepted the implicit agreement. That night, Ethan slept in the car again, by choice. Now, however, in a safer place, with better blankets and the engine running. It wasn't empty pride, it was a need to maintain control. Richard returned home with a strange feeling. He had solved a concrete problem, but created others, invisible ones. Questions, resistance, watchful eyes within the company itself. The consequences were only beginning, and none of them could be easily undone. The following days demanded changes that could not be postponed. For Ethan, the first challenge was to reorganize his own routine. With the car working again, the possibilities expanded, but so did the responsibilities. He began to accept extra shifts at alternating times, balancing work and school with a discipline that had previously been impossible to maintain. The fatigue was still present, but now there was a clear difference. Effort was beginning to generate progress. The school noticed the change. Teachers observed more consistent work and more focused attention. One of them, a math teacher, called Ethan after class and mentioned a partial scholarship for a local technical course focused on basic mechanics and logistics, areas with high demand in the city. The opportunity wasn't guaranteed, but it was real. Ethan wrote down the address, carefully put the paper away, and placed it in his backpack next to old bills and car parts. He didn't celebrate. He just kept going. Richard, on the other hand, faced a different kind of challenge. Within the company, his behavior was beginning to cause friction. He questioned reports that he had previously approved without carefully reading them. He requested revisions to cost-cutting plans, demanded field visits, and asked for data that wasn't in the executive summaries. To some directors, this sounded like instability. "This isn't sustainable," one of them said during a tense meeting. "You're personalizing decisions too much." Richard listened, aware that there was truth in it. Still, he did not back down. "I'm taking responsibility," he replied. "There's a difference. Growth was not accompanied by applause. On the contrary, it was met with resistance. Ethan also faced unexpected challenges. One night as he left the cafe, he found a sign stuck to his car's windshield. An informal notification, no parking in that area after a certain time. It wasn't a fine, but enough of a warning to cause concern. He would need to find another spot, further away, less illuminated. Instead of panicking, she drove to a community center Marisol had recommended. There, a small parking area was designated for vehicles overnight, with lighting and occasional volunteers. It wasn't comfortable, but it offered stability. Each choice began to show a clear evolution, less improvisation, more strategy. Meanwhile, Richard decided to support Ethan in a less direct way. He didn't want the help to turn into dependency. Through his contacts, he suggested internship opportunities and educational programs without imposing anything. Ethan chose what to accept. The technical course became a reality weeks later. The evening classes required more travel and planning, but they offered something new, applied learning that made immediate sense. Ethan disassembled engines in class, understanding faults that he had previously only intuited in his own car. The transformation was visible in actions, not words. Richard was also changing, though more quietly. He began visiting logistics centers unannounced. He spoke with employees on night shifts. He heard stories that would never appear in reports. Each conversation reinforced the perception that his company operated on an invisible basis of daily sacrifices. None of these movements was heroic in isolation, but together they formed an arc of real growth. On the last Friday of the month, Ethan arrived at the parking lot earlier than usual. The blue sedan was clean, not out of vanity, but out of care. The engine ran smoothly. He turned off the car, grabbed his backpack and headed to class. Richard watched from a distance, without intervening. For the first time, the boy didn't seem like someone who was merely resisting. It looked like someone was moving forward. The newly achieved equilibrium was fragile. Ethan realized this the morning he received an official letter from the school. The letterhead informed him of a mandatory meeting with the principal and the student council. The reason wasn't explicitly stated, but the formal tone suggested something serious. He carefully folded the letter and put it away, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest return. That same week, Richard was facing his own countdown. The company's board of directors had called an extraordinary meeting. Investors were questioning recent changes in operational strategy, especially the suspension of previously announced cuts. The quarterly figures were still positive, but the trend worried those who prioritized aggressive growth. "You're losing focus," said one of the board members in a preliminary call, "and that has costs." Richard knew that this meeting could define his future at the head of the company he had built. The subplots were beginning to come together. Ethan attended the meeting at school, accompanied by his counselor. The board presented an anonymous complaint. Someone had reported that the student did not have a fixed address. According to district policy, this was not grounds for expulsion, but it did require formal referrals, evaluations, and possible transfer to alternative programs. "We want to help," the director said formally, "but we need to follow procedures." Ethan listened in silence. He knew that procedures usually meant loss of control. The risk wasn't just academic. It was the possibility of being separated from what he could still manage on his own. On the other side, Richard prepared for the confrontation with the board. He gathered data, but also stories. Traditional reports shared space with field records, turnover rates, hidden costs generated by dehumanized decisions. It wasn't an emotional speech, it was a redefinition of efficiency. Tension was rising. The cold returned to the city, more intense than ever. A new weather front was approaching, threatening heavy snow. Ethan's car was ready, but any prolonged delay could put him at risk again. The night before the council meeting, Ethan parked his car at the community centre and mentally reviewed his options. Shelters, temporary programs, the possibility of accepting institutional help that came with strict rules. None of the options seemed good, just less bad. That same night, Richard drove through the empty parking lot of the building. The distant spot was occupied as usual. The blue sedan was there. The constant presence of that car had become a silent marker of everything that was at stake. The following day, the two would face decisions that could not be postponed. There was no more room for gradual adjustments. The system, school, corporate, social, demanded a clear answer. Whatever the outcome, the impact would be irreversible. The snow began to fall before dawn, covering Chicago with a thin, treacherous layer. The streets grew quieter, as if the city were holding its breath. Ethan started the car carefully, waiting a few seconds before setting off. The engine responded steadily. Still, he knew that day would not allow for mistakes. The meeting at the school was scheduled for mid-morning. Meanwhile, on the top floor of the corporate building, the board of directors met around a long glass table. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture firm, but aware that this position had never been so precarious. The meeting began without further ado. "We need to talk about leadership," said the chairman of the board. "Your recent approach is deviating from what investors expect." Richard didn't interrupt. He waited. "Slow growth, emotional decisions, unnecessary exposure," another member continued. "Some advocate for his replacement if this continues." Richard took a deep breath. Then he stood up. "You talk about efficiency as if it were just an equation," he said, projecting data onto the screen. "But efficiency built on human instability exacts a price, a high one." He showed graphs on turnover, training costs, and logistical delays caused by exhausted employees. Then he turned off the projector. "And now I'm going to speak without slides." He told stories, not full names, nor exaggerated dramas. Objective accounts of people who depended on unreliable transportation, impossible schedules, and forced choices. He spoke of the real impact of the decisions made in that very room. "This isn't charity," he said, repeating his own words from weeks earlier. "This is real sustainability." The silence that followed was not one of agreement. It was one of shock. Meanwhile, Ethan was sitting before the school board. The director was talking about protocols. The advisor was mentioning support programs. Then came the direct question, "Do you have a place to live?" Ethan hesitated for a second. He could lie. He'd done it before. But something had changed. "Not fixed," he replied, "but I have a plan. I study, I work, and I support myself." The response did not end the matter. On the contrary, it opened the door to decisions that were not under his control. That's when the door to the room opened. Richard entered, still wearing the same suit he'd worn to the board meeting. The snow was slowly melting on his shoes. He shouldn't have been there. The corporate meeting hadn't officially ended yet. "I apologize for interrupting," he said calmly. "But this is important." Everyone looked at him, surprised. Richard presented documents, a supervised temporary custody agreement, validated by a company lawyer, an address, a formal educational support plan, without adoption, without advertising, without lifelong dependency. "He's not abandoned," he stated. "He's supporting himself, and I'm taking legal responsibility so that he can continue to do so." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. The director carefully leafed through the papers. Silence stretched on. Finally, he nodded slowly. "That changes the framework," he said. Hours later, Richard returned to the corporate building. The council was still meeting. He entered the room again, this time without introductions. "If my leadership no longer serves the values you uphold," he said, "then perhaps it really doesn't." One of the members cleared their throat. "You risked everything today." "No," Richard replied. "For the first time, I've got everything lined up." The vote was quick. Not unanimous, but sufficient. Richard remained as CEO, with new guidelines approved. Less aggressive, more sustainable. Outside, the snow was falling harder. Ethan started the car and drove out of the school parking lot. For the first time, he wasn't just going to survive the next day. I was heading towards a possible future. The climax wasn't an explosion. It was a choice. The snow remained for days, but it no longer posed a threat. Ethan woke up early, no longer in the car, but in a small rented room near the community center. It wasn't large, nor comfortable in the traditional sense, but it had constant heating, a table to study at, and a fixed place to leave his backpack without fear. The blue sedan remained essential, but it was no longer a shelter. Now it was just transportation, and that changed everything. The routine took on a more defined shape. In the morning, school; in the afternoon, work; at night, the technical course. The tiredness was still present, but there was a clear difference. Each effort had direction. Ethan began to understand systems, engines, logistics. He started to see connections between what he learned in the classroom and the workings of the city around him. Chicago ceased to be just a hostile space and became an understandable map. The agreement with Richard was clear and limited. There was no luxury, no undefined favors, just a temporary structure with goals and deadlines. Ethan maintained autonomy. He paid part of the symbolic rent when he could. He kept track of expenses. He was accountable, not because someone demanded it, but because he needed to prove to himself that this wasn't a perpetual concession. At school, the stigma of reporting him lost its power. Formalizing the situation brought stability. Teachers began to treat him not as a problem to be managed, but as a student with real potential. A graduation project began to take shape, a preventive maintenance plan for small fleets, based precisely on failures like those that had almost left him stranded. Richard, for his part, felt the weight of the consequences of his choices more broadly. The company underwent slow but profound adjustments. Subsidized transportation programs for employees were implemented. More flexible schedules reduced absenteeism and tardiness. Reports, months later, showed something few expected: stable productivity, reduced costs in hidden areas, and higher retention. He was still being questioned. He still faced resistance. But now he knew how to support every decision, not just with numbers, but with real impact. The parking lot for the corporate building had also changed. The distant parking space continued to be used, but now by other simple cars, authorized as part of an internal program to support employees in transition. Ethan's blue sedan appeared there less frequently. When it did, it was clean, functional, and discreet. On an ordinary afternoon, Richard ran into Ethan in the lobby. There were no speeches. "Is the car all right?" Richard asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, for the first time. They went their separate ways soon after. No promises, no applause. Life hadn't become easy, just possible, and that was enough. Years later, the blue sedan still existed. It no longer roamed the same streets, nor did it carry the urgency of bygone days. It was parked in a driving school on the south side of town, used as an example in practical lessons. A simple, sturdy car with a history. Ethan would sometimes pass by him and touch the hood, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. It had all started there. Richard, now less present in headlines and more attentive to behind-the-scenes matters, understood that some decisions don't appear in reports, but they change destinies. Not all of the world's problems have been solved, but one of them was confronted at the right time. If this story made you reflect on choices, judgments, and second chances, share in the comments what struck you most. Stories like this aren't just about money or success. They're about humanity, responsibility, and the impact of a single decision. If you believe that stories like these deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel, like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Your participation keeps these stories alive and can inspire many more.